Southern Utah is stunning. A land of ancient red rocks, sculpted canyons, and towering mesas that look like they were pulled straight from another planet. Its geography is unlike anything else in the American West, and its ecosystems, while harsh, are quietly rich with life. But for all its natural grandeur, there's one big question hiding in plain sight. If you look at southern Utah's population density patterns, one thing stands out immediately. The rest of Utah is growing fast, while the south remains almost empty. Why is that? Why does southern Utah remain so underpopulated? To understand that, we need to start with the land itself. Southern Utah stretches across roughly 40,000 square miles of the Colorado Plateau, a massive elevated tableland sitting between 5,000 and 11,000 feet above sea level. Unlike the relatively flat terrain people associate with desert, this landscape is anything but uniform. It is sliced apart by deep canyon systems, punctuated by towering sandstone formations, and broken up by mountain ranges that rise dramatically above the surrounding plateau. Beneath the surface lies layer upon layer of sedimentary rock, sandstone, limestone, shale, deposited over hundreds of millions of years, and then slowly carved by wind and water into what you see today. The Colorado River and its tributaries, especially the Green River, did most of that carving. The result is a terrain so broken and so vertical that even today, large sections of it have no roads passing through them at all. The climate shifts depending on where you stand. At lower elevations in places like St. George, the weather is warm and dry, almost Mojave-like, with scorching summers and mild winters. Move up onto the plateau and things change dramatically. The high country around Cedar Breaks or the Aquarius Plateau receives heavy snowfall, and temperatures can swing 40 degrees between day and night, even in summer. The region sits in what climatologists call a rain shadow, blocked from Pacific moisture by the Sierra Nevada and the ranges of Nevada to the west. What little precipitation arrives comes mostly as summer monsoon storms, brief and violent, more likely to cause flash floods in the canyons than to soak into the dry soil. And it's this exact geography, the rock, the elevation, the aridity, and the sheer verticality of the landscape that has shaped not just southern Utah's identity, but where people have decided to settle, and far more often, where they decided they couldn't. Utah is one of the fastest growing states in the country, home to over 3.5 million people, but the overwhelming majority of them live along the Wasatch Front, a narrow urban corridor running through Salt Lake City, Provo, and Ogden in the north. Southern Utah, by contrast, looks almost untouched on a population map. Vast, open, and only lightly settled across an area larger than many eastern states. So why the stark divide? A big part of the answer still comes down to geography. Unlike the Wasatch Front, where rivers flowing down from the mountains created fertile valleys and reliable water supplies, southern Utah offers almost none of that. Water is the defining constraint of life in this part of the world, and the Colorado Plateau has very little of it that's easily accessible. The same canyons that make the landscape so visually extraordinary also make water delivery, road construction, and infrastructure development extraordinarily difficult and expensive. You can't build a city where you can't reliably get water in or wastewater out. And for most of southern Utah's history, that problem had no practical solution. And while the Wasatch Front developed around mining, agriculture, and eventually manufacturing and tech, southern Utah's economy was slower to find its footing. Cattle ranching and small-scale mining sustained communities for generations, but neither industry generates the kind of density or economic momentum that builds cities. The region sat geographically close enough to Nevada's railroad corridors and Arizona's agricultural valleys that it was never developed as a major hub of its own. That early absence of economic infrastructure still echoes today. Where the North boomed with industry, universities, and a growing technology sector, the South remained more rural and slower to industrialize. Northern cities built momentum. Salt Lake City, Provo, and Ogden all grew rapidly through the 20th century thanks to manufacturing, the railroads, military installations, and later a booming tech industry that earned the region the nickname Silicon Slopes. In contrast, southern Utah's largest city is St. George, a regional hub with a fast-growing population and a strong tourism economy. But even as the fastest-growing metro in the state for several years running, it remains far smaller than the urban centers in the north. Beyond infrastructure and industry, climate plays another role in the population split. Northern Utah's valleys, despite cold winters, offer reliable agriculture, plentiful groundwater, and 4 distinct seasons that many Americans find appealing. Southern Utah, with its extreme summer heat at lower elevations and its long, harsh winters at higher ones, doesn't offer the same year-round livability for most people. And unlike southern Florida, which draws retirees with its warmth, southern Utah's heat is a different animal entirely. Triple-digit summers in St. George and the surrounding lowlands are no small thing, and the lack of humidity that makes it bearable in the morning becomes brutal by early afternoon. Tourism followed the scenery, not the infrastructure. Southern Utah is home to 5 national parks: Zion, Bryce Canyon, Capitol Reef, Canyonlands, and Arches. More national parks in a single region than almost anywhere else in the country. Millions of visitors pour through them every year. But tourism, unlike manufacturing or tech, doesn't necessarily translate into permanent residence. People come to hike the Narrows and watch the sun set over Delicate Arch, and then they leave. The towns that support that tourism, Springdale, Moab, Torrey, Kanab, all remain small by necessity, limited by water, land, and the sheer logistical difficulty of building in canyon country. Out across the wider region, the numbers tell the story clearly. St. George, the largest city in southern Utah, has around 100,000 people in the city proper. Moab, one of the most visited destinations in the American West, has fewer than 6,000 permanent residents. These are important communities, but they are not population centers in any meaningful urban sense. And there's one more quiet reason for southern Utah's settlement pattern: governance. An unusually high percentage of land in southern Utah is federally owned. Somewhere between 60 and 70% of the total land area, depending on the county, is managed by the Bureau of Land Management, the National Park Service, or other federal agencies. That land cannot be privately developed. It cannot be sold. It sits outside the reach of local zoning and tax revenue and urban expansion. In a region already constrained by water and terrain, the fact that most of the land itself is simply unavailable for development has kept population numbers low in ways that have nothing to do with desirability. And all of this brings us to one curious twist in the region's story. Why does southern Utah look the way it does on a federal land map in the first place? Back in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, as the federal government was working out what to do with the vast unsettled territories of the American West, large swaths of land were withdrawn from private sale and placed under federal protection or management. The Antiquities Act of 1906 gave the president the power to designate national monuments, and presidents from both parties used that authority repeatedly across southern Utah. Theodore Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt, Bill Clinton, and Barack Obama all designated or expanded monument boundaries in the region. Each designation locked additional land away from private development, mining, and grazing. A decision that conservationists celebrated and that many local residents and county governments bitterly opposed, a tension that remains alive today. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles to the north, Utah's other half was transforming. Cities growing fast, tech companies arriving, housing developments racing up the mountainsides. The north had water, infrastructure, and economic momentum, but this success came at a cost. Because while southern Utah may be underpopulated, northern Utah may be dealing with the consequences of growing too fast. Utah is one of the most ecologically diverse states in the American West, home to an extraordinary range of species and habitats, from the alpine meadows of the Unitah Mountains to the cryptobiotic soil crusts of the Colorado Plateau. Those fragile living surfaces that take decades to form can be destroyed by a single footstep. Its rich ecosystems generate billions in tourism revenue and sustain tens of thousands of jobs. But today, parts of that are under real pressure. Because over the past decade, the same growth that made northern Utah a destination for young families and tech workers has pushed development further and further into sensitive habitat. Roads expand, wetlands are filled, entire subdivisions are built on land that once belonged to sage grouse, pronghorn, and a dozen species of native fish found nowhere else in the world. And it doesn't stop there. Southern Utah's national parks are now experiencing a crisis of a different kind. Too many visitors. Zion National Park received more than 4.6 million visitors in a recent year, more people than the entire population of New Zealand, cycling through a canyon system with one main road and a handful of trails. The town of Springdale, which sits at the park's entrance, has fewer than 600 permanent residents trying to absorb that wave. Moab faces the same pressure from arches and canyonlands. The infrastructure simply wasn't built for these numbers, and the landscape itself, the cryptobiotic soils, the desert springs, the fragile canyon ecosystems, is showing the strain. So here's the big picture irony. Southern Utah may be sparsely populated, but the land itself is not being left alone. The people who do come are arriving in concentrations that the ecosystem was never designed to handle, funneled into a handful of access points by the very terrain that kept development out for so long. Northern Utah may be booming with economic success, but that growth is now pushing up against the limits of its water supply and available land in ways that planners are only beginning to reckon with. Southern Utah's population gap isn't just about where people live, it's about the future of the entire Colorado Plateau. So the next time someone tells you Southern Utah is just a drive-through on the way to the national parks, remember this. It's also a story of two very different regions within a single state, one racing forward and one holding its breath. A tale of canyon silence and urban momentum, of water scarcity and federal ownership, of millions of visitors and almost no one who stays. Because in Utah, the divide between north and south isn't just about population, it's about what this land can sustain, what we choose to protect, and how long we keep those two things in balance before one of them gives way.